Hello, everyone. I am going to be talking today about Paulogia. He's a YouTube atheist. Looks like he was a former Christian turned atheist, and he puts out a lot of video trying to debunk Christianity. He pushes evolution, and he does everything he can to pull people away from Christianity. I'm going to be talking today about a video he did. It looks like a series of videos regarding a Christian that did a video. Not exactly sure which video it is, but the video that Paulogia is doing is called "Does God Exist? Many Absolute Proofs, Part 3." So he's going to go on to try to debunk the Christian claims regarding how humans could not have been evolved due to complexity and other reasons. But Paulogia is going to try to debunk what the Christian is saying, but not actually bring his own proof. He's going to talk about different books that's out there, but never actually bring them to the forefront to show us why we're incorrect as Christians. But he's going to push evolution there. He's going to say there's thousands of them. So we'll start a little bit of the video. Let's see if we can fast forward through it. He does go on and on without really saying anything to try to trick people, but we'll start a little bit of it.
The question of God's existence invokes a long controversy.
There is no God.
You know for a fact that there is a God.
There is no God. There is no God.
What I said was, God exists, and he's American.
But in the proper light of science, anyone can see the truth.
Do you see the truth now?
Why can't you see the truth, huh?
Part 3 brings more incredible proofs from the natural world.
Incredible! They're talking apes!
While supposed experts claim all life gradually evolved after the Big Bang,
Why hasn't it evolved like the rest?
I don't know. Maybe because it was refrigerated?
you will see additional powerful evidence that everything around us could never be the product of cosmic accident.
I think we may have found your cosmic reason for being here.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, that's part 3 of David C. Pack's Many Absolute Proofs of God series.
And now, David C. Pack.
First is the human eye.
Of course it is.
This amazing mechanism is spectacularly complex and an inspiring testimony to God's supreme intelligence.
Any theological argument from complexity is problematic on multiple fronts.
So here, David C. Pack is the Christian that's doing a YouTube video, and Paulogia is trying to debunk the video. So David C. Pack is saying that the eyeball is very complex, and it shows that evolution can't be true, and God is the only answer to this. Now, Paulogia is what he's going to try and do is trying to say that since something is complex, we can break it down and say that it came from non-complex things, and they became, over time, added together, became complex. But he never shows how that's possible. In theory, it might be true, but in reality, it doesn't make sense. So we'll continue watching.
Not the least of which is that a mark of sophisticated design is simplicity rather than complexity. Complex systems arrive from attempts to navigate limitations and working with tools at hand, rather than the type of system one might arrive at free of constraints, like David's God would be. The argument from complexity is also an appeal to incredulity, or gaps in understanding. The inability for an individual, or indeed an entire species, to presently understand the inner workings or the developmental history of something tells us nothing about the origins of the thing. It's just an acknowledgement of the current lack of understanding. Lastly, complex.
So if you listen to Paulogia try to make his claim, he's actually never saying anything. I'm going to rewind back what he just said to see if it actually makes any sense to refute the Christian argument let's see what he says. Let's listen to it again. And you have to understand what a liar is. How he twists things around to not go to the subject and go away from the subject. So David C. Pack is saying that the eyeball is very complex, and Paulogia is going to try to forget about the complexity and talk about something totally different and try to push you away from the actual eyeball, how it's complex. Let's listen to that again, see if we can catch him on what he's actually saying.
Complex and an inspiring testimony to God's supreme intelligence.
Any theological argument from complexity is problematic on multiple fronts.
So a teleological argument from complexity is problematic. Why is that problematic? Let's see. He's just making a blank statement there.
Not the least of which is that a mark of sophisticated design is simplicity.
So now he's saying a mark of sophisticated design is simplicity. But that doesn't always fit, because there's sometimes things that are complex need to be complex, and if they're simple, they won't work. So that argument alone makes absolutely no sense. But what he's trying to do, he's trying to pull you away from the eyeball being complex in nature. He wants to say, no, it's simple to begin with, and then slowly we can make it more complex through a bunch of simple parts of it. But that doesn't make sense. It's complex altogether. You can't take one part of it and make it work. You need all of it. That's why it's complex, and it works together.
Rather than complexity, complex systems arrive from attempts to navigate limitations.
Complex systems arrive from attempts to navigate limitations. That's pretty much saying nothing. I'm not even sure what that... Let's listen to that again to see if we can understand what he's saying. And that's one way you can catch a liar, is by not speaking simply. So when I speak as simple as possible that everybody will understand it, and if somebody doesn't understand it, I'll simplify it more and more. I won't complicate it. Right now, Paulogia is not really saying anything. He can talk about the eyeball itself, but he's not. We need to attack the argument right where it is, but he's not actually doing that. What he's saying is he's using theory rather than what's in front of us. So let's listen to what he's saying again about complexity.
And working with tools at hand. Sophisticated design is simplicity rather than complexity. Complex systems arrive from attempts to navigate limitations and working with tools at hand, rather than the type of system one might arrive at free of constraints.
Rather than the system would arrive when you're free of constraints. It doesn't mean much what he's saying. It's very hard to follow what he's trying to put out. But if you listen more and more, he's trying to lead you somewhere. But if you didn't understand exactly what he was trying to get to in the beginning, it's hard to understand what he's trying to get to at the end. But at the end, I'm going to tell you, he's going to try and say that all complex things came from simple things, all added together became complex. What she's trying to say is it's evolution that did it, which, again, in theory it might make sense, but in reality, those complex things will never come together. They'll never survive. They won't work if they're not all together at the same time, put together by a mind.
Like David's God would be. The argument from complexity is also an appeal to incredulity or gaps in understanding.
So, argument for complexity is saying a gap in understanding. The evolutionist will say that we don't know what the answer is. A Christian will say the answer is God. God did it. It's very complex. There's no other way that we can explain this to be this way. Evolution doesn't explain it. Only Christianity does. So what the evolutionists will say is, then, since we can't explain it because we don't have the knowledge for it, the Christian is explaining it with God, then it means they're explaining it with no understanding of God, because there's a gap in our knowledge. We're saying no, there is a reason why we're saying it's God, because if you start adding up all the other reasons for the universe, it all points back to God. But by design, God didn't make it where you could see it clear. You can only see or see it up close. Like if you see an eyeball, you'll say, well, it could be God, could be evolution, could be a lot of things. But then if you step back and look at the whole human, you look at the whole universe, then you say, wait a second, none of this could be evolution. This has to be a God, because looking further away, you can see the entire universe, you can see all the complexity of it all working together. Then it makes more sense that it can't be evolution. It has to be some kind of mind, some kind of God that put the whole thing together. But Paulogia is never going to look at the whole picture and say, wait a second, how could this all be all put together by evolution? He's going to look little by little. He's going to look at it with a microscope and say, oh, you see this little germ? You see this little thing moving around? This is what it is. But we'll say, wait a second, how did the whole thing come together? He won't explain that. But he's trying to trick people.
The inability for an individual, or indeed an entire species, to presently understand the inner workings or the developmental history of something tells us nothing about the origins of the thing. It's just an acknowledgement of the current lack of understanding.
So when we explain something using God, he's going to say we're acknowledging we don't understand it. We're saying we do understand it. Something that's this complex, with this much design, with this much complexity, we understand it doesn't happen through nature, because nature is not intelligent. Nature can't do things. It can't decide to do this or decide to do that. It doesn't decide, well, this is going to be the best for humanity or best for the person, so let's develop this ability so we could survive. Evolution and nature is reacting, right? It's always reacting, but it's never planning. It's not designing anything. What Paulogia is saying is, because at the end of it all, it's all designed, so we're saying, well, in the beginning must have been some process to design it, but it's not a mind. So that's where the tricks are coming in. But he's not coming through and saying it's not God, it's this. He's saying that because we don't know what it is, and he doesn't know what it is, then we must be wrong. It can't be God. But we're saying there's nothing else it can be but God. It's not like they're going to wait another 1,000,000 years of technology and all of a sudden they're going to know it's not God. At the end, it's going to be God no matter what. We're telling them ahead of time it can't be anything else. It must be God, because we looked at the entire picture and that's the only thing it can be. But we don't have exact proof. He's right. But that's by design. God didn't want us to have exact proof. And I'll go back to my argument of why. Because if God gave us all the information and he showed himself to us, no one could doubt God, right? And Paulogia doesn't want us to understand that. He doesn't want to understand that for us to have free will, the only way to do that is if God doesn't give us too much information. He gives us just enough information to not doubt him, but not enough information to not be able to say that 100% God does exist, right? So everything's pointing to God, but because there's so many things pointing to God, it must be God. But if you look at it with a microscope and say, well, this eyeball can't be made by God, because we can figure out ways how it could have evolved, which they really can't. But then when you put the whole thing together in the head, where you put together and you connect it to the brain, and you connect it to the nervous system, and you connect it to everything else that comes together with it, then we say, wait a second, the eyeball is complex as it is, but the fact that it's in the socket, the fact that it has tears, the fact that it connects to the brain and how the brain reacts to the eye, tells us that there's more to it than evolution. It can't be just evolution, because evolution doesn't come close. Even millions of years from now of technology won't bring it together, because it doesn't look like it can ever come together.
Lastly, complex things are inevitably a combination or accumulation of less complex things. The seeming weightiness of complexity arguments tend to fall flat when looking at a different scope or scale.
3 statements from one source represent the magnitude of difficulty in the human eye evolving to its extraordinary complexity. The most amazing component of the eye, as a camera, is its film or retina.
This part of the video was frustrating for me on a few fronts. David said his 3 statements are from one source, a potential red flag, but I may never know, because while I'm familiar with David Minton, a retired biology professor currently on staff at Answers in Genesis, I can't find the eye work that is credited. It doesn't.
Right now, Paulogia is going to go on and on about how he can't find the body of work that the Christian is referring to, and he'll go on and on about why he can't find it, and it doesn't make sense that he can't find this information, but he's not talking about the actual information. The fact that the eyeball and the camera are both complex, but the eyeball is far more complex than the camera. And then he'll go on about how the digital camera is more complex than the eyeball. It could pick up infrared light. It can, but there's certain things that the eyeball can do that the digital camera can't do. And again, he's focusing just on the eye. We're saying, how's the eye connected to the body, connected to the entire nervous system, to how we think, how we see, light, all these things that Paulogia will not touch. He's just going to focus on one thing that this guy says, but he'll miss the whole point. He'll go on and on. I'll try and fast forward to some of this waste of time that he's doing.
Seemed to be a book or an AIG blog entry. Names and confusing wording here that I'd love to have clarified with context. Now, I don't know if Minton's quote here uses film because it predates digital photography, or if he chose it because the limitations of film better illustrate his point, or for some other reason. But it's not even clear what he means here by range of light. There are certainly film and photosensors able to capture the ultraviolet and infrared spectrums of light that are not visible to the human eye. Perhaps he means dynamic range.
So as you see, he's going to go on and on about what he meant about how it's more complicated than film. But that's not the whole point. The point is that it is complex. Is it more complicated than film? It will be a digital camera 100 years from now that's more complex than the eyeball. That doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the eyeball is amazing to begin with, and it has complexity, and we need to explain how it came about. Will there be things more complex than it? Sure, there might be, but it doesn't take away from it. That doesn't take away how it fits in the eye and how it all fits together, that it can't be done on its own, because we don't see nature creating things that are complex because it designed it that way, right? We see things in nature that kind of come together as a result of other things, but they never come together at the right time unless somebody put them together. Due to its complexity, if they all didn't come together at the same time, they wouldn't have worked. So that's the issue Paulogia is having, but he's dancing around the subject. He's trying to pick on some things that the Christian is saying, but it's regardless of the point of which is more complex. Did he say film rather than digital camera, right? So he's playing around, trying to distract the sheep so he can suck them into his lies, and he's not being straightforward. When I speak, I'm as straightforward as possible. When Paulogia speaks, he's going to dance around the subject as much as possible.
The ratio between the lightest and darkest regions of a scene. This wouldn't be a particularly helpful comparison, as modern cameras and a quick single glance not be phones with multiple. I can't look it up. But this whole notion of comparison to cameras is strange, because the argument would have been more compelling 100 years ago, and will be less compelling in another 100 years as technology improves.
You see how he's trying to make a point that 100 years ago, if you made the comparison eyeball to the camera, then yes, the eyeball is far more advanced. He's saying, oh, now 100 years from now, the eyeball won't be as advanced, but still the eyeball is what it is. It's amazing and it fits together and it all works. We're saying, how in the world did evolution create all of this from, a small molecule, right? We're saying it doesn't make sense that a molecule would evolve into a human being. We can't see, a germ or a hot gas exploding and eventually, after billions and billions of years, becoming what they are now. It makes no sense. But somehow he is dancing around the subject of how it's possible by distracting the listener. But somebody like me, I know a lie when I see it. I study lies. I study the devil. And Paulogia, I think, has some kind of issue that he became atheist and now wants everybody to be an atheist. So definitely he's motivated for all the wrong reasons.
I'm fully expecting there to be mechanical replacement eyes for humans in my lifetime that will be superior. Well, I'm unconvinced that these are completely accurate, or perhaps merely not phrased precisely. Let's just blow through the data that David finds compelling.
The human retina can handle the dynamic range of light of 10 billion to 1 or 10 million times more. There are over 10 million such cells in the retina, and they are packed together with a density of 200,000 per millimeter. Because the retina is thinner than the wavelength of visible light, it is totally transparent. In an article published in the computer magazine Byte, Dr. John Stevens said, to simulate 10 milliseconds of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times, and would take at least several minutes of processing time on a crazed supercomputer.
I really want to tear into this one. A quote from a 1985 computer magazine.
You see what he did there? The Christian talked about the details of the complexity of this eyeball, and he talked about maybe a magazine that was put in 1985. So instead of Paulogia talking about the eyeball and the things that this gentleman said about the eyeball, he talks about, oh, you got this information from a magazine in 1985. So he didn't talk about the eyeball and the retina and all the amazing things this gentleman said. I couldn't even remember what he said. There were so many things that he said that were mind-blowing if you really think about how in the world is this eyeball this complex. And he skips past that. He doesn't talk about the complexity of it. He doesn't say, oh, wow, yeah, it is an amazing thing, how it comes together, all these facts that he said. Instead, he talked about, the magazine's from 1985.
Just 2 pages away from an ad for a special deal on a 20 megabyte hard drive for $1,099. For reference, the PDF file I found of the magazine issue is 65 megabytes. So back when this article was written, the contents of just one magazine used over $3,000 in storage. They didn't conceive of a day we'd all have crazed supercomputers in our pockets, mapping bunny ears on our face.
So you see how he's not talking about the eyeball. He's going on and on about the technology of the day that magazine was written, that we wouldn't conceive how technology would be better, that we can have more data, but that doesn't take anything from the eyeball. What he's trying to do is he's trying to distract people from the actual facts of the eyeball by talking about other things. He's distracting people. He's not making any argument against what the guy said.
This is in real time, so I'm not sure they're awe should inspire the same today. But the point here isn't whether Dave is accurately representing the eye or computational power. The point is that Dave wants us to be impressed with the human eye.
You see? Now he came around. Because remember, a liar is always going to give you some truth, but he's going to twist it. So now he came out and said, yes, we know Dave isn't talking about any computation of computers, but he was, obviously. He was talking about, at that time, computer computation was much weaker. Now it's much stronger. He said, I know that doesn't really matter. We're talking about the eyeball. Now let's see how he addresses the eyeball.
And now that we're done with the eye specs, it's time to find out what leading evolution proponents think about it.
So he admitted that the eye specs are there. He didn't say that they're amazing. He pretty much said now that we're done with the eye specs. But he never really talked about eye specs. Paulogia never did. Just the Christian did. Paulogia just went on and on about other things to try and distract. Now he's going to say, let's see what the leading evolutionists say about the eyeball. But he never said anything about the eyeball himself. Paulogia never did. Let's see what he goes on with.
Evolutionary biologist Dr. Ernst Mayr, considered the Darwin of the 20th century, once said, "It is a considerable strain on one's credulity to assume that finely balanced systems, such as certain sense organs, the eye of vertebrates, or the bird's feather, could be improved by random mutations."
Well, that sounds like a quote taken out of context. Sure enough, on page 296 of his 1942 book, Systematics and the Origin of Species, Dr. Mayer acknowledges how counterintuitive some of the evolutionary precepts were to an unfamiliar public, but immediately followed with the reality of the situation. However, the objectors to random mutations have so far been unable to advance any alternative explanation that was supported by substantial evidence. That a notion is counterintuitive has no bearing on whether it is true, and experts in the field acknowledging that the evidence sways them to a different conclusion than their initial intuition might only undermines the simplistic and error-prone approach that David takes in this video. This is incredibly similar to the Charles Darwin quote about the eye that nearly every creationist takes out of context.
In Origin of Species, Darwin remarked that the whole idea of something so flawless could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, he said, absurd in the highest degree.
Yeah, that one. You didn't disappoint, David. In The Origin of Species, Darwin spent the entire chapter following that sentence with details about his understanding of eye evolution. Again, refuting the notion that intuition and common sense should be accepted above investigation and evidence to the contrary.
So this is a good way to catch Paulogia. We pretty much go on and on about how evolutionists miss the mark on how eyeball could have evolved and how the feather could have evolved. Then we have another passage regarding that evolutionists took some data and it became obviously wrong, but we never talked about the actual eyeball, how it actually came to be through evolution. So the fact that he's not actually addressing the topic at hand is distracting, and really you don't know what he's trying to say. So let's listen to it again to see if we can kind of dissect the words to see if he's actually making a point or not.
Computational power. The point is that Dave wants us to be impressed with the human eye. And now that we're done with the eye specs, it's time to find out what leading evolution proponents think about it.
Evolutionary biologist Dr. Ernst Mayr, considered the Darwin of the 20th century, once said, "It is a considerable strain on one's credulity to assume that finely balanced systems, such as certain sense organs, the eye of vertebrates, or the bird's feather, could be improved by random mutation."
So here he's saying, the Christian is saying that evolutionists say it doesn't make sense that the eyeball and the bird feather came from random mutations, which they're admitting that evolution is not working. But let's go on.
Well, that sounds like a quote taken out of context. Sure.
But now he's saying that that quote itself, which is very clear that they're saying it doesn't make sense, he's saying it's out of context. But now if you continue reading, he's going to say, oh, it's going to now make sense that Christianity is wrong, but it doesn't.
Sure enough. On page 296 of his 1942 book, Systematics and the Origin of Species, Dr. Mayer acknowledges how counterintuitive some of the evolutionary precepts were to an unfamiliar public, but immediately followed with the reality of the situation. However, the objectors to random mutations have so far been unable to advance any alternative explanation that was supported by substantial evidence.
So in other words, however, the objectors to random mutation have so far been unable to advance any alternative explanation that was supported by substantial evidence. So the objectors is us to random mutation. He's saying that they have not unable to advance any alternative explanations to support substantial evidence. We're saying, no, we did. The substantial evidence is God. The fact that everything is so complex, the universe, if you look at it from the teleological argument, if you look at all the moral arguments, you look at all the arguments for Christianity, if you put them all together, the only answer is God. And then when we look at the eyeball, when we look at evolution, we're admitting here, he's even admitting, the evolutionists are admitting that random mutation is not working. And they're saying is, yeah, we agree that random mutation is not working, but since no one else came with a better idea, that we're gonna argue that this is the best idea. We're saying, no, we did come up with a better idea. You're not listening to it. It's God. You're looking at all the evidence for God, and you're throwing it away. When we put it all together and we look at it from far away, it all makes sense. What they want to say is, we say, well, let's not look at it far away. Let's look at it up close. We'll say, okay, fine, we'll look at it up close. But then we're also going to look at it from far away to see if it makes sense. They never want to look everything from we call it the 30,000 feet view from far away. They want to look everything really close so no one can put it together. I believe Frank Turek has a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And there he explains that all the evidence for God is kind of like a puzzle. Every piece on its own doesn't make sense, but when you start putting all the pieces together and you start getting further and further away and you put all the pieces together, then everything looks like it makes sense. So what the atheist wants to do, he never wants to look at anything from far away. He wants to look at it up close. So in this passage here, Paulogia does not make any argument against Christianity other than the fact that he's saying that we didn't come up with anything. So he's disregarding what we came up with in saying that the fact that the evolutionists say that random mutation doesn't make sense, then they're saying, but we have nothing else. They're disregarding what we came up with. So you see how the tricks come in. But you got to read. We got to look at what they're saying very, very closely to understand it. And I might have to watch it 5 or 6 times to see, okay, what is he trying to say here? Because he's not clear. And right now, he's not saying anything against Christianity in this little passage.
That a notion is counterintuitive has no bearing on whether it is true, and experts in the field acknowledging that the evidence sways them to a different conclusion than their initial intuition might only undermines the simplistic and error-prone approach that David takes in this video.
So let's listen to that sentence. That sentence, to me, doesn't make much sense. But let's listen to it a couple times, see if we can catch what he's trying to say here.
Out of context. Sure enough, on page 296 of his 1942 book, Systematics, some of the reality of the situation. However, The objectors to random mutations have so far been unable to advance any alternative explanation that was supported by substantial evidence. That a notion is counterintuitive has no bearing on whether it is true.
So if a notion is counterintuitive, it should have a bearing if it's true or not. So if we know that nothing can't come, or something can't come from nothing, that is, and if somebody says, oh no, it can, then that's counterintuitive. We say, well, that doesn't make any sense. They're saying, no, it does make sense, or it doesn't mean that it's your God, but they're going to try and push their idea, even though it's counterintuitive. So let's continue listening.
And experts in the field acknowledging that the evidence sways them to a different conclusion than their initial intuition might, only
So he's saying that the experts, meaning the evolutionists, are saying that they are being swayed towards a different direction. So in other words, they were thinking evolution, they were thinking the eyeball and the feather came from random mutation, but when they study it, they're saying it's not coming from random mutation. So now they're being swayed away from their initial thought. And that's telling us that it's something else, that they're wrong, but they want to stick with evolution, even though random mutation is not supporting their idea. Let's see what he's saying.
undermines the simplistic and error-prone approach that David takes in this video. This is incredibly similar to the Charles Darwin quote about the eye, that nearly every creation...
So what he's saying is, we're making a mistake by saying simply that it's God. But they're not proving how we're saying that we're making a mistake, that it's by God. They're just saying that our idea is very simple, that God did it. That means it can't be true because we're in error by saying something like that.
This takes out of context.
In Origin of Species, Darwin remarked that the whole idea of something so flawless could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, he said, absurd in the highest degree.
Yeah, that one. You didn't disappoint, David. In The Origin of Species, Darwin spent the entire chapter following that sentence with details about his understanding of eye evolution.
But he never told us anything about evolution. He said that Darwin spent hours and hours and chapters of explaining to us. But Paulogia went on and on. I think there's about a 30-minute video. But he never explained what Darwin said. He didn't come up with the facts. He just said that Darwin explained it. Okay, well, if we look at what Darwin explained, we can beat up that argument. We say, wait, that argument doesn't make any sense, because Darwin, even himself, admitted that the idea that, let me see exactly what he said, and he's going to try to pick on this exact phrase.
That the whole idea of something so flawless could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, he said, absurd.
So Darwin is admitting something so flawless could not have come from natural selection. He says, I confess that it's an absurd idea. And of course, that's a shot at all the evolutionists, because if their guy is saying that, and Darwin's their guy, that's the guy that pretty much they hang their everything on, he himself is admitting this, which then Christians use that against them to say, wait a second, your own guy says, he confesses that it's absurd. But now he's saying that, after he said that, we took it out of context because Darwin then went on for many, many pages of how the eyeball actually evolved. But if that was true, Paulogia could have easily picked a couple of things out of those pages and showed us, we're wrong, it can't be God. The eyeball formed this way. But if we look at the eyeball and we ask him, okay, Mr. Darwin, how did this eyeball form from a hot gas, right? If everything came as a hot gas, and then over billions of years formed into an eyeball in our head, they don't know that. They don't know how it went from a gas to our eyeball. They'll say, well, we weren't there. We don't know how it is. All we can do is we can study what's in front of us. They can try to study microevolution. And I believe in microevolution. I believe that certain species could evolve within their own species, right? It's a small little microevolution where over certain things make you maybe grow more hair, maybe your skin color changes from the sun and now become darker in order to absorb the sun better. But those are small micro evolutions that don't form over billions of years into something totally different, right? An ant can't form into a eagle. A little spider can't eventually become an elephant, right? And these things, and it's not just within the species. We got grains of sand. We got we got all types of things in this world, in this whole universe, that all came from a hot gas. It doesn't make any sense. And even evolutionists don't really say it's from a hot gas. They just say that was the beginning, and when it exploded, certain things happened, and other things happened, and they don't know. They don't really know what happened. They're just guessing on. They're really doing God of the gaps. They accuse us of filling in the gaps, but the evolutionists have more gaps to fill, and they're filling them with pretty much nothing. If you talk to an evolutionist, at the end of the day, they're going to say, well, really, we don't know, but we know it's not God. That's really, at the end of the day, what they're going to say.
Highest degree.
Yeah, that one. You didn't disappoint, David. In The Origin of the Species, Darwin spent the entire chapter following that sentence with details about his understanding of eye evolution. Again, refuting the notion that intuition and common sense should be accepted above investigation and evidence to the contrary. The fact is that the proposed mechanisms for human eye evolution are well documented, and most of the stages remain well represented in creatures that are alive today.
The story of the human eye begins with a simple light spot, such as the one found in single-celled organisms like Euglena. A more complex version of this light spot can be found in the flatworm Planaria. Being cupped rather than flat enables it to better sense the direction of incoming light. Over the millennia, as such light cups grew deeper in some organisms, the opening at the front grew smaller. The result was a pinhole effect, which increased resolution dramatically. The nautilus, an ancestor of the octopus, uses this pinhole eye for improved resolution and directional sensing. The key step towards the eye as we know it is a lens. This is thought to have evolved through transparent cells covering the opening to prevent infection, allowing the inside of the eye to fill with fluid that optimizes light sensitivity and processing. Crystalline proteins forming at the surface created a structure that proved useful in focusing light at a single point on the retina.
So right here they said they're doing some illustrations of how a little spot on some organism took in light and then all of a sudden formed eyeball, and then there's a lens that formed, and then they found that lens was useful, so it continued to form. So they're thinking that nature goes towards usefulness, and it doesn't. It goes towards whatever it can grab. It's not going to say, oh, this lens is useful, let's continue creating this lens. And that doesn't make any sense, because there are certain things that happen randomly, but there's certain things that they don't come together for useful sake. Because remember, nature is destructive. It's random. It's not. It doesn't come together through randomness, right? It just doesn't. Randomness doesn't form an eyeball. Randomness will destroy things. Sometimes randomness will create things, but if you look at the complexity of this eyeball and say it happened randomly, I mean, you're almost insane at that point if you're even thinking that, yeah, that makes sense. But usually it's not insane. People don't want to believe in God. So they'll do anything. They'll close their eyes. They'll look the other direction. They'll know, like, wait, that doesn't make sense. How can randomness form this eyeball? But they'll go on and on with this and all of a sudden forget that, okay, how did this eyeball go in the head? How did it form? How all these things have eyeballs, right? Is it because they all form from the same hot gas that all these creatures have eyeballs? Did they all evolve together? Did they, I mean, you know, it just doesn't make any sense how a hot gas can eventually form an eyeball in a head connected to a brain. You know what I mean? So it just, none of that makes any sense that if it was random. And that's what they're trying to say.
It is impressive how far the sophistication of the eye has come since the first photosensitive cells.
Again, any liar has to say some type of truth from time to time. So far, I think I've heard Paulogia say one or two things about the eyeball. Right now, he says it is impressive how far it's come, right? But he never explained to us how it came from where it was, which is really a hot gas, if they're saying hot gas was eternal, into an eyeball. They try to do some illustrations. Those illustrations really meant nothing. They were assuming that lenses are forming because they're useful, right? Again, nature doesn't form things because they're useful.
But that journey was a journey, one step at a time.
Again, so now he's saying, he admits that the eyeball is impressive, but he's saying one step at a time, that journey formed the eyeball. But we would have to have a lot of faith in what he's saying to say, yeah, that eyeball formed through a journey, right? So I'd almost rather believe that God did it than some journey from some kind of speck of a hot gas into evolving into something this complex. It makes no sense to me. God makes more sense to me.
Next comes a tiny, little-known creature, the Australian termite.
You know enough termites, dear.
This particular termite differs from all others. In fact, it's 4 creatures in one. Each depends on the others for continued existence, where you cannot have one without all the others.
You can't have one without the other.
Let's see. A curiosity I studied in microbiology class was a microorganism called Mixotricha paradoxa that lives in the gut of Australian termites. When it was first discovered, it looked as if it was covered with a bunch of curly hairs. Looking closer, it was revealed that these were not hairs at all, but spirochetes, a totally different type of microorganism. On the Mixotricha, there were bumps or appendages where the spirochetes attached, and bacillus, which lodged on the other side of the bump. The spirochetes provide a means of locomotion for the entire colony of microorganisms. They are 3 totally different germs that decided to live together in a community. So, what you have is an interdependence between a large microorganism, a spirochete, a bacillus, an Australian termite, and even the trees the termites feed upon. I suppose if you're an evolutionist, you would have to believe that at one point in time they formed a committee and decided to all work together.
I'm not sure if David is trying to make a joke with this caricature, or if he's wildly mistaken about biological evolution.
So David is talking about some type of termite that has something inside of it that has multiple living organisms that kind of live together and work together, and they're termites, so they eat wood and trees. But what he's saying is that, or David is saying that it's impossible for these things to have come together randomly, like they all came together and said, hey, let's all come together for this purpose. So we know that it wasn't a meeting, so David's making fun of that meeting. Now some Paulogia pretends he doesn't have a sense of humor. He's saying, is that a joke? Yeah, of course it's a joke. We're making fun of the atheists. But again, the silliness of Paulogia to not understand that he's being made fun of or try to wave it off tells you that he's not being realistic.
Or perhaps some of each. But taken at sincere face value, no. There was obviously no committee meeting of non-sentient organisms. Evolution is undesigned and guided only by whatever allows life to have greater reproductive success.
Right, so he just admit right there that evolution is undesigned. It can't be designed. He knows that it doesn't become designed. He's saying whatever has more success is what it's going to go to. But nature and evolution don't care about success. They don't have a brain. So they can go towards things that are unsuccessful, right? It's not that they're going to evolve into something successful because they want to live. Now a human or an animal, they have a will to live. But evolution and nature don't have a will. They don't have any type of mind. They're not going towards anything if it's just random evolution, right? It's not moving a certain direction like it wants to live. It wants to become something. It doesn't think, it doesn't aspire, hey, I want to live, I want to have kids, I want to do this, I want to do that. What Paulogia just said, and let's listen to that one more time where we can show that these were the lies are coming and he's building on top of these lies here.
Obviously, no committee meeting of non-sentient organisms. Evolution is undesigned and guided only by whatever allows life to have greater reproductive success.
So it's guided by whatever allows life to have more reproductive success. Because if evolution is going towards reproductive success, it would have to have some kind of mind, some kind of purpose. But nature and evolution, if it was just random, it wouldn't have any kind of thought to succeed, to want to live, because it's not a mind, it's not a being. It's just nature itself. It's just how we describe how things are. But nature itself was designed, but it was designed in such a way to kind of work. But it had to have something when it designed it to tell it to go a certain direction, right? But it's not the deciding factor on how things should live, because a lot of things die. In nature is designed for the strong to eat the weak. That means all those weak will continue to die. Well, that tells us that Paulogia has no argument against Christianity. His own argument is saying that nature wants to do something. Makes no sense.
There are papers on the evolution of the Australian termite ecosystem that David could have looked up and read if he'd been so inclined. And while we could get into it, the symbiotic relationships that creationists will point to generally fall into the same pattern of development.
Again, Paulogia will never get into anything. He's going to say there's papers. He's going to say, there's thousands of chapters about this, but he'll never pick something out of them to try and destroy the argument, to show us how things actually are. And that's where you have to catch a liar like this to show that he never actually comes up with proof. He just says, the proof's in those papers, go look at them. Show it to us. Show us one or two sentences to how that's possible. But he won't.
So I'm going to start with an analogy that, while far from perfect, can hopefully shed some light on the general mechanism, and then we can move back to the specifics.
So now what he's going to do is, I think he's going to go on for a couple of minutes with this analogy that makes absolutely no sense. It's most ridiculous analogy about how somebody was some fictitious creature liked eating these type of hot dogs, but then we explain how these hot dogs came about because a factory was making one thing, another factory was making another thing, and another factory was making some other thing, and all of a sudden, just by pure accident, one of those creatures ate something from this factory and realized it's nutritious, and then they said, oh, well, we can have this nutritious thing and this other thing that we eat. It was like a hot dog. You put it together, it's going to become better for us. And then that factory started making more of those products because these guys were buying more of it. And then they decided to branch out and do other things. Another factory decided, once they saw people buying this, then they decided, oh, let's make some of this product. And all of a sudden it became that product. But he goes on for, I don't know, maybe 5-10 minutes. And none of it made sense because those factories had to make decisions to do these things. And we all know that nature is random. It doesn't make decisions. But the factors he's talking about have to decide, well, let's do this over this. Let's make a decision. Oh, people are buying more of these. Let's make more of these, right? But instead of wasting our time with this ridiculous analogy, he could have talked about those papers, because he told us there's all these papers that disprove what we're saying, but he doesn't want to talk about those papers. He wants to talk about this ridiculous analogy about some fictitious cartoon that he drew up and made up. Again, this is all a distraction. He's trying to distract you from the truth. And many sheep, and I call people that believe in him literally sheep, because for them to follow this line of thinking, they have to be sheep, because it doesn't make sense. They're not saying, wait a second, forget about your silly little analogy, little cartoon, fictitious creatures that you made. Why don't we talk about what's in those papers? Do those papers actually disprove Christianity? Does it prove macroevolution? It doesn't, because that's why he didn't come up with those papers. He didn't talk about them. He talked about something else. So again, people like this will say a lot, but won't say anything. What we're saying as Christians is that everything points to Christianity, to God, to Jesus. Everything that the evolutionists talk about just try to pull you away from God, but when you get there, there's really nothing there. So it's a tough subject to get into, to try to disprove something like evolution, because of the distractive ways that somebody like Paulogia will talk. So if we debated him one-on-one, we would bring him back to the facts. We'll say, show me those papers that you're talking about. Of course, he'll say, I don't have them. Go study them. Well, I'm not going to study them if you didn't bother bringing them to me, right? If there's something really to them, let's look at them. Let's see if they make any sense. But every time those papers try to make a move, I'm going to say, wait, how did you get there? Oh, yeah, we got here this way. Well, show me. How did you get there? How did you say you went from a hot gas, that's what they're going to start with. How did you get to this point and that point? They're going to have to say, we don't really know, but by studying microevolution, we're going to assume that this happened. So they're using assumption. Well, we're using assumption too. They say, oh no, you can't assume, but they can assume, right? So I'm going to assume that something has to come from something else. Something can't come from nothing. They'll say, oh no, you can't assume that, but they can assume all day long, right? So the atheists, if you really debate them and you really corner them, you're going to see what a hypocrite they are. And I think I want all Christians to at least open their mind to see the hypocrisy of the atheist and to call them out on it, because the atheist, like Paulogia, is taking a lot of sheep, and we have to at least tell these sheep, hey, watch out, you're going the wrong direction. These guys are tricking you. Now, if they want to continue going that way, so be it. Let them go that direction. Let them go any direction they want. God gave them free will. If they want to follow something this silly, go for it. Sorry for the long talk, but there's a lot to cover, and there's a lot of sheep we need to help. So thank you.